It is my great pleasure and privilege to be sharing this stage with three people for whom I have the greatest respect and of whom I am a fan in all three cases. And I could go on about why I love their work as much as I do. But I'm going to start by simply having them address the idea of democracy in this country. And I'm struck, given that, for instance, and understandably, the half of the, if not more, of the Biden re-election pitch is routinely summarized as democracy, democracy, as if nothing else need be said about what that means. And it, of course, effectively doesn't, given his opponent and the party he opposes. But democracy is a word not in the Declaration of Independence, not in the Constitution of the United States. And one of the novels I wrote was set in 1848, when democracy had just begun maybe to acquire something like its modern meaning, although socialism and democracy were virtually synonyms at the time. So I'm curious about the evolution of democracy from a word that referred to ancient antiquity, ancient Greece and so forth, to what it came to mean by the end of the 19th century. And am I wrong to imagine that it hasn't, after sort of appearance and becoming the normal colloquial way people talk about the American system and political life, that it kind of hasn't evolved in the last century as much? Or is it now suddenly evolving and we must adapt our notions of what democracy even means?
Okay, I guess it's me. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for coming, and thank my fellow panelists who are really fantastic, and I'm honored to be here. One of the ways in which the book I just wrote took off was back in 2015-16, as the Trump campaign developed. I was really struck by the way in which a variety of observers, many journalists, others who were very thoughtful and educated, talked about the way he violated liberal democratic norms. I was struck by that because as a historian, I wasn't exactly sure what those were. And after all, by 2015, the Supreme Court had intervened in a presidential election. We had Citizens United. We had the basically undermining of the Voting Rights Act. Many states were in the process of redefining their election laws to make voting more difficult, especially for certain kind of populations. And I think it was, for me, it was sort of an opportunity to reflect on, in fact, how shaky what we call American democracy has always been. The way in which it has been exclusionary, the way in which it has been based on the repression of certain groups of people, the denial of rights to certain groups of people. And so, in my own work, I thought I would see what I could learn from kind of exploring those roots. But I think, as you say, democracy is not something that surfaces very early in the founding of the American Republic. I mean, this is certainly something that Heather writes about, and it took a long time. But even in periods that one of the things I try to do in my book was not pick out moments that were clearly objectionable, but in fact those moments when we associate most directly with democracy and democratic developments, and to suggest the complicated ways in which those were really defied. So I think it's important for us to at least recognize what we're up against, and it's not something that has happened in the past few years or past few decades, but it's something that has pretty deeply entrenched.
Was there not, I think part of the one of the reasons that Trump was seen as this sudden shift in things is that nobody until him had gotten in the way, at least, of the myth of incremental constant progress towards a fuller democracy. And he seemed to stand up and say, all but say, and now says, I'd like to be a dictator, that he's against, effectively, democracy. Certainly he's a milestone of newness, despite whatever roots that existed of our less than full, let alone perfect democracy. Is that correct?
That speaks right to your work.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I think what is interesting is what we see. So even newer than the idea of democracy is the idea of multiracial democracy, right, which goes even beyond, and is still an idea in its infancy in an American context. We have been it has been a very small, if the story of America was five television seasons long, this is the plot twist at the very end that makes everyone stop watching the show, right? You've watched 4 seasons of America, and at the very end, they're like, sure, what if we let the black people vote, maybe have a president, and it's like, this is not what the show is about at all. What are you guys talking about, right? But I say that to say that what we have seen throughout the history of the United States has been at times when there have been steps towards making our practice match our principles, however we define those principles, we almost always see a reversion to the mean and a backlash to them, right? Charles Blow, who I was talking to yesterday, in his book, he talks about how we basically have a 50-year horizon. Every 50 years, we take a pretty remarkable step toward multiracial democracy, equality, equity, and then immediately we see a pretty remarkable backlash to that, be that through the results of the riots of enslaved people and then the crackdowns that we see in response to that, whether the Civil War and Reconstruction government and then the white supremacist redemption that comes following that, the advances of the civil rights movement that then usher in the 70s and 80s and the Reagan era, right? And then we elect a black man to be the president, begin grappling with structural and systemic inequalities, and now we are locked in a reactionary political movement and moment that we're in now. And so it is very interesting because we're not that long into the hindsight beyond the election of a black president and also, frankly, the remarkable demographic shift of the country, which is happening and that speaks to this moment. And when we look at the history, the moment we are now in is actually very predictable. This was what was going to happen. It challenges, especially those of us who have been born into an America where we have the idea of multiracial democracy. I think what is hard for us is this has held up a mirror to show the distance between our principles and our practice, right? That we are actually not occupying a full multiracial democracy, even as many of us, in fact, a majority of us believe in that. And I think that is part of what's been so disconcerting for so many people.
And Heather, I mean, Steve talked about how, illiberal America traces the roots of these anti-democratic impulses in American history. As, once upon a time, at least, an historian of the Republican Party, was the party of Lincoln between the beginning and let's say, the civil rights moment? Were there roots or like, oh, I see that coming of this extraordinary authoritarian turn?
So there are 3 questions there. One is the origins of the Republican Party in the 1850s and their original ideology, which the party has not embraced since Eisenhower. And they've gone back and forth since then. And then there's the next question of whether Donald Trump was an aberration, and I would say that he was not. He held up a mirror to what a certain population had been primed to want. And then there is the question that you also asked about what democracy is. And, I'd like to start with that democracy idea. It's a very basic one. It's in the Declaration of Independence, that you have a right to be treated equally before the law and you have a right to have a say in your government. Those are freaking revolutionary. But let me just say about these 2 men sitting next to me, their books are fabulous. And I have to say, Steve Hahn's new book, that one, the topic is a little off-putting, but I was trying to think of the words that would describe it. when I was coming down here. I think I said this to you earlier. There is this gentle lyricism to his description of the way illiberal thought has developed in the United States that makes you feel like it's authoritative without, I can't sleep tonight. This is the way the world is, but it doesn't have to be this way. And similarly, oh, I'm sorry, and I didn't blurb it, actually, or anything. I liked it. I liked that book a lot.
Hopefully someone was recording
Anytime.
that for the paperback. You've got it.
And Wes's book is how we got here from a much closer time. And it's this window into how we got this white lash against the rise of multicultural democracy in the present. But I had a question for you, too, that speaks to the same point that you're making, and that is, what drives the moments when we don't fall into that illiberal democracy or into that white lash? Because I don't believe they're inevitable. And also, and I'm really treading here, Steve is the country's expert. I shouldn't probably have said that. One doesn't like to say that because I'm sure I pissed somebody off.
The older you get, the more you
On
can be
populism.
referred.
And there's a really interesting dichotomy in your books, the
Yeah.
trajectory of your books, that the populists are good in the 1890s, and
Yeah.
now they're bad in the whatever year we're in. And I wonder if that has to do with those questions, because isn't that what we're really talking about? If we're losing the right to have a say in our government and to be treated equally before the law, why the hell are people putting up with that?
I'm leaning on the foremost expert.
Well, and let me just add an extra question on that same question, which is, and I'm thinking, oh, we're in Louisiana. Oh, there was a left-wing populist who was accused of being a fascist here 90 years ago, Huey Long. Is that, even though, but he was trying to do good, we may think, if we're left. But is that eruption of basically anti-democratic feeling in the service of some, he thought, higher, better goal, along with the demagoguery and everything that we see today, a different thing or simply a different ideological package?
Well, Huey Long's a very complicated figure who in some ways embraced left and right and certainly power. One of the things that's really fascinating is that if you go back to the turn of the 20th century, when the Socialist Party had been organized and was running for office on we tend to think about Eugene Debs in 1912, but in point of fact, the Socialist Party elected many, many people to the state legislatures and to local offices, and where did this happen? In Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and the Dakotas. You know, Milwaukee had a socialist mayor for a long time. And then we might want to ask why the red states became the red states, right? So I think that's, a really important issue. I think the issue, one of the things we need, there is a sense that history is a linear thing, that somehow or other we build on gains that we have made before and we keep moving. It's kind of the American redemption story. We have sinned in the past, but we are trying to...
Born again.
Yeah, we're trying to, sort of rectify those sins. And, when Barack Obama was elected, the first response, which didn't take very long, was, now we're in a post-racial society when, of course, as you point out, the backlash was already taking place within days. And, of course, the Tea Party was organized not long after that. I think the question that Heather raises is a really important one, which is, what are those moments when there is not only simply a pushback, but a kind of eruption of something new and different? What sort of circumstances make that possible? And what sort of aspirations and visions go into that? I mean, we have seen that over the course of U.S. history in some extraordinary ways. Certainly the civil rights movement was one of those. We see them in smaller ways around us on a regular basis. And I think it's an important issue to think about how we can create circumstances in which change that we can really embrace, is possible. It's a pretty dispiriting moment now.
As I was thinking about that question, the first thing I was thinking about was even less of a historical lens and more of a sociological, psychological lens of that. And I was thinking of the scholar Derek Bell, who is one of the founders of the critical race theory as properly defined, not Fox News version critical race theory, but actual critical race theory. But one of the things he wrote about was the idea of interest conversion, that one of his key, and Derek Bell had been a civil rights attorney across the South, actively working on desegregation and voting rights. And much of his political science afterwards was based on the idea of why didn't this work? We spent all of this time invested in these legal fights, and yet racism is still all over the place and seemingly intractable in what's going on. And his interest conversions theory, and he said it in a racial lens, but I don't think he would mind me applying it even more broadly than that, right? Is that the moments where we see significant progress towards multiracial democracy, multiracial equality, are moments in which the majority, the white majority of the country, believes it is in its own self-interest to pursue equality, right? That we do not embrace democracy as an idea just because we think it is a good thing. We embrace it collectively in the moments when we believe it is best for us individually. And in the moment when that shifts, be that due to a war, due to economics, due to a reactionary backlash about what's being taught in schools, or about changing racial or gender norms, or about any number of things, those then become the moments where we collectively step backwards, right? But that when we see the moments, whether it being, the country's being torn apart over slavery, and we actually can't exist if we don't get rid of this thing and figure that out, right? Or moments where the cities are on fire, and this seems like a major threat to us, and all they want to do is be able to vote? Yes, let them do that, right? That we have moments where the collective believes it is in its own best interest to now bestow democracy upon a minority, be that a racial minority, a gender minority. But the problem is those end up being momentary moments of clarity, not actually long-term sustained beliefs. And that in the moment when suddenly it is no longer in what we no longer believe it to be in our own collective best interest, right? Suddenly we start to see a reversion to that.
I wonder, and I have wondered, if in addition to the obvious civil rights moment and the backlash to that beginning in 1964, and the Voting Rights Act, and various attempts at extending civil rights, affirmative action in all of its forms, if in addition to that, at the same time, of course, instituted by the same Democratic president who signed the Civil Rights Laws, Civil Rights Act, our immigration laws were radically changed. And we went from a country that had for essentially 200 years been 85% white pretty consistently to a country that over, less than, half my lifetime, or a little more than half my lifetime, to 60-something% white. That's a huge change beyond any expansion of rights for non-white people, right? It seems to me that in terms of when we look for something, what drove this large backlash that we're seeing on the right among Republicans, that's got to be a big part of it, is it not?
Well, I don't think Steve would disagree with me on this, that we tend to get the expansion of liberal democracy at a time when people's economy feels very good. And the fact that since 1981, as much as $53 trillion have moved from the bottom 90% of the population to the very top has not helped. But I actually want to join Dr. Bell on this, because I think it's interesting that Abraham Lincoln managed to convince a whole bunch of white men that they should get behind the idea of emancipation at a time when the North was really in bad shape. There's a depression in 1857. And it really looked like the North was going under, and it really was going to be the South that was going to call the shots going forward, simply because they're the ones who had all the money. And I wonder if the answer, at least the answer for me, is that the way you fight back against the inevitable attempt of a minority to take over from the majority, which is what we're looking at in all of these periods, is by the way we construct the arguments, by our storytellers. And one of the things that worries me, and I think that we have seen really since the Voting Rights Act, and even since before that, after World War II and the establishment of the liberal consensus, when the Republican Party buys onto it under Eisenhower, is the fact that we thought it was a done deal. You know, people still say, well, they're never going to touch Social Security. I got news for you. There's a plan on paper to touch Social Security. Oh, they're never going to touch Medicare. There's a plan on paper to touch Medicare. And, oh, come on, Roe v. Wade is the law of the land. And I wonder if that Roe v. Wade overturning in June of 2022 with Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization decision is the moment that finally has woken people up to say we've got to reconstruct how we talk about the issues of democracy.
And the next third rail, if indeed they started cutting Medicare and Social Security would be discovered. I believe that you're right, they have a plan, and that has been the goal of certainly the donor class of the right forever, since the New Deal. But it strikes me that especially, I'm curious about what you all think about the Republican Party today. In this, you know, it has been for 60 years this odd, strange bedfellows combination of the business roundtable corporate leaders and the rich, and increasingly the white working class, whose interests, one has to say, are ultimately economic interests are in opposition to each other. I understand deflections can be put up of, oh, trans people, oh, bathrooms, oh, all those, up to a point. But can they continue forever without this contemporary version of the Republican Party exploding?
So I would argue that beginning in 1986, that supply-side economics, donor class, as you're calling them, part of the Republican Party, recognized it didn't have the votes. It's in 1986 that we start to see voter suppression under the idea of ballot integrity, which was designed to throw black people off the polls. We know that from memos that we've seen. It's also in 1986 that we get the deliberate attempt to start packing the courts with the idea that you no longer actually have to legislate in Congress and elect people to Congress if you can get 51 votes in the Senate, because then you can simply pack the courts with right-wing people and throw cases into the courts, and those will have the benefit of becoming law without ever actually having to go through Congress. And Edwin Meese, who was Ronald Reagan's Attorney General, actually said that this is what he was doing. He was going to make sure that the Reagan Revolution could never be overturned, no matter what people said at the polls. And that was because they were worried about the 1986 tax cuts. At that point, they also recognized they needed voters, and so they quite deliberately brought what they called traditional voters, people who wanted to make sure women stayed subordinate to men, and segregationist voters, racists, into the Republican Party, never expecting that they would start to call the shots. So and the way they kept those people behind the Republican Party was to increase the heat of the rhetoric that they used. Mm-hmm. So that the idea that somebody is liberal, which used to include Republicans as well as Democrats, became an epithet. And then we added, first it was black people who were dangerous, then it was brown people, then it was women, and then it was Democrats. And by the time we got Trump in office, it was even Republicans who didn't agree with him. I mean, the people who are true Republicans now are, Trump, his brother, and I don't know, the neighbor down the street. Basically, they're such a small group. But the current day Republican Party is no longer the Republican Party. It is dead. The Republican Party is dead. For years people said to me, is the Republican Party going to die? And I kept saying, no, it's really not. It's got the lists, it's got the traditions, and it's got the money. Well, guess what Donald Trump has monopolized? The lists, which are now grifter lists, the money, of course, is all now currently, after 2 weeks ago, going into the Trump organization. And the pieces that used to keep the party together and I thought would make it reborn are gone. And it has become something very different that we have never seen before in the United States, and that is a party that is the Trump party. Mind you, this is not a statement about Republicans. The Republican Party is a grand old party that has a great history, and its ideology is deep in our DNA. You may not agree with it, you may agree with it. That's not what's going on in this party. What we have now is an authoritarian party that is trying to destroy democracy. And that either has to get moved offside and back under the rock it belongs under, or it's going to destroy our country.
But won't it? One of the things that I remember, the final commercial in the 2016 election of Donald Trump's, 2 minutes long, the script almost could have been a Bernie Sanders commercial. It was anti-Wall Street, anti the elite picking your pockets, don't touch Medicare. So, I mean, of course, he didn't govern that way. It was the first of the biggest lies. And the question is that tenable to sort of say that and campaign on that? Wow, that's why. And I think a large fraction of his voters in 2016, yeah, he's different than Republicans. He
was, in 2016, he was the most moderate economic Republican
Exactly.
running. He called for infrastructure, he called for better health care and cheaper health care, he called for getting rid of the tax loopholes, and he called for bringing back manufacturing. Of course, none of that actually happened. As I said, we're in a very different place right now. But I actually think this goes back to the question that I was asking Steve about, because you talk about American democracy, and that means the voice of the people. So how come sometimes the people seem to do good things, and sometimes they seem to do bad things, and we tend to remember the good things, like with the American Revolution, remember the good guys, and not the ones who burned down New York? And I wonder if the answer is that we tend to champion populism when it is directed by people who move it toward expanding rights, versus when we move it toward people who are reducing rights. And I don't know if that's the case because, of course, the populists were virulently anti-Semitic. Right. And that's why sitting on a stage with the country's top person in populism, I'm like, I get to ask about mobs.
Well, let me say a couple of things. One is that, first of all, I think it's important for us to recognize that, the social base of Trumpism, I think, has oftentimes missed the fact that it's not the white working class. It is small business people, it's almost classically fascist with sort of petty bourgeois folks, people who are in construction, people who are in, very potentially volatile and difficult circumstances, which might help us understand why their populism has none of this sort of economic critique that the populists of the late 19th, the populists of the late 19th century, whatever their other shortcomings, and that's exactly right, focused their attention on the economic oligarchy. And they focused their attention on the way in which the elite enriched themselves at the expense of everyone else. And they proposed a platform that was designed to weaken that power and redistribute wealth. This is not what populism now is basically a synonym for rage, right? Mostly white rage that's directed against elites who are like us, who don't have economic power, because that's not what they're demanding. They're talking about elites who are seen as having cultural power, who are seen as potentially violating their sense of normalcy and their sense of order and the world that they grew up in, so to speak. One of the things I did want to mention, and I think it's related to Heather's point, in 1986, to use that year, I was involved in the voting rights lawsuit in Mississippi. It was brought by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and what we were doing was challenging, this is 1986, 20 years after, basically 20 years after, the Voting Rights Act, right? What we were challenging was Mississippi's dual registration law, which meant that you had to register twice in order to vote, once in national elections and once in state and local elections. And you could only vote at the county courthouse between 9 and 5, Monday through Friday. Now, at that point, the black population of Mississippi had few motorized vehicles. The county courthouse was a symbol of racial repression. Now, we managed to win that case. even with a Reagan-appointed judge, because it was so egregious. But one of the things it does demonstrate is, and I think this gets to Wesley's point as well, is that over the course of our history, the only people who have been committed to an expansive idea of democracy are the people who have been denied it. And what we need to recognize is they're the ones who need to take a leadership role in trying to help us understand what kind of country we want to live in if we believe in the values of some of our earlier foundational documents, like the Declaration of Independence, because the people who believe in them are most likely the people who have not benefited from the world that these documents have made.
Wes, I have a question for you about, as I have seen in my lifetime, my recent lifetime, the Republican Party go from a normal, decent conservative party to what it is today, and you, however, are the child on this panel. You're 37, and so I mean,
are we getting into that now?
Well, that basically you came of age as the party was going off the rails, right? I mean, you weren't born that long before Pat Buchanan was winning primaries and so forth. So is your point of view, like so many young people I know, for instance, my daughters, affected by the fact that they don't know a system, a healthy two-party system?
No, I've never witnessed such a system, right? It's an idea, but it's not something that's ever existed in reality. Certainly not during my cognitive lifetime. There's an argument that I was alive for a day in which we had, but in terms of a moment I can remember, certainly not, right? And I think that, and I get it. And I think what is true and what is hard has been I think that there was even as we got into 16, there was a belief, so much of the branding in elite spaces, so much of the understanding in polite elite spaces, where we're all at the same cocktail parties, or we're all at so-and-so's book thing, or and this Republican senator is just this. There was always an understanding in the club of, well, certainly some of our people are like that, but you know us, we're not this way. And I do think that actually likely led, in some cases, to an overestimation of the extent to which the institution that was the Republican Party could hold and would hold. There was an underestimation of the extent to which these hostilities that had been stoked within their base actually were the thing binding together the collective, not small government, Paul Ryan economic ideology, not even, frankly, our conceptualization of the early 2000s compassionate conservatism, evangelicalism, right? That is actually a very different subsection.
We haven't talked about that, right?
So I think that was it's watching all of that come together, and the clarity with that has been very interesting, right? I think even to this day, it can be difficult to speak with clarity around the extent to which, we do know what the ideological pillars of our present-day Republican Party are. They are just completely different than how we conceptualized and imagined the Republican Party of old. And understandably and reasonably, there was not a desire to too quickly throw out a history, even as I think even the leaders of this party had underestimated or not correctly identified the extent to which they had lost the plot of what was going on.
Right.
One of the things one might say is that I'm not entirely sure when we have had a healthy two-party system, or at least the question is, healthy for whom? MAGA tries to evoke a past. It's not in time, we probably know when that was. But political movements often talk about a kind of fantasy of a past that has somehow been disrupted, undermined, or so on. And then when we go back to look at actually what this world was like, it bore no resemblance to the fantasy that's being laid out. And I think we need to take, a kind of hard look and at least not embrace this idea, which is, is comforting in some ways. If we had a healthy democracy recently, if we had liberal democratic norms that were robust, then what we're looking at is kind of noxious weeds that are growing in a soil that's not fundamentally contaminated. And the question is the soil contaminated? George Wallace ran for president for the first time in 1964, and he did well in the Midwest. He ran again in '68 and threatened really to turn the election into the House of Representatives. And had he not been the target of an assassination attempt in '72, it's not entirely because he'd already won a slew of primaries and finished second in others. Then we move back into the to 1920s and the Klan, which was undoubtedly the largest social movement in the country, that it had enormous political power at all levels of government, and it was organized around, they believed in democracy too. They believed in democracy for white Protestants who were native born. And they thought that was an America that they were going to fight for. So I'm not trying to say it's all the same thing, but I'm trying to say we need to be skeptical about the sort of story that we're being told, because I think if you're interested in moving on to something better, we need to, look at what we're really up against.
But these are noxious. It is
They
more
are.
noxious. You're not denying that, of course. That
No.
These people are a different kettle of fish than John McCain.
Yes.
Okay. So we all hear and probably maybe talk about and nod along with the description of this election as a kind of do-or-die moment, that Trump and MAGA represent an existential threat, that even extending sometimes to people who say, well, if he wins, it's the last election we'll ever have. How much alarmism is too much alarmism, do you feel? At this moment.
Well, I would say, I do think we can take Donald Trump at his objective word for what he intends to do if he's elected president. And I feel, and he has laid out horrifying plans that by any definition would be considered oppressive, fascist, and anti-democratic, right? And so I think that it is both true that we have seen that, having lived through 4 years of a Trump administration, and now almost a decade of the Trump era in American politics, right? We certainly have heard a lot of things that could be described as alarmism, and there's certainly a fatigue that comes with that. But what is true is that when someone runs for president, you take the things they say seriously. And the things that the former president is currently saying about what he would do in office are things that, on their face, threaten the very core of the democratic ideal. And I think and I don't think it's alarmist to say that, right? I do believe that, according to Donald Trump presents an existential threat to American democracy as we know it.
The only thing I would add to that is I agree 100% with that. The only thing I would say is that while Donald Trump is a problem, so is any Trump-like figure. Mm-hmm. So that if perhaps he does not end up being the nominee in 2024, anybody who adheres to the people and the principles that he has outlined is a problem. It is not just one man, it is a movement.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I am somewhat reassured by my continuing belief that Donald Trump, I couldn't agree with you more about he was in his evil genius, brilliant way, was able to tap into what was there ahead of anyone else. I think, however, repeating Trump for just any old person, like, say, Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump had all kinds of unique capacities, having been a TV star, for instance, all of it. It's easier said than done to be the Trump replacement, first of all.
Yeah, I'm just pointing out that 2025 project is 30 of the leading radical right
I know,
organization.
but you'd still need a candidate to be its cult figure vessel, is all I'm saying, and that's harder.
They've been around for a while.
But let me ask you guys another question. And you mentioned, the Reagan judge in the 1986 case who, besides being a Reagan-appointed judge, ruled for you and for justice. Again, playing, I guess, angel's advocate, we have seen the federal judiciary, and even leaving aside the Supreme Court for now, but not necessarily, we've seen them, it seems to me, as if we're looking for vessels of hope and having been a bulwark against Trumpism. Whatever he says he wants to do and the dictatorial, fascistic things he says he's happy to say he wants to do, we have a judiciary. Can we not at least rely on them not collapsing under the thrall of Trumpism as elected Republicans have done?
So if Trump is elected in 2024, he does not need the judiciary, except as a rubber stamp. But I do think your point is very interesting because the people who are on the Supreme Court understand that. And I think that will act as a check on what they are willing to rubber stamp between now and 2024 with the recognition that they might be deciding themselves out of relevance. And relevance really matters to the people on the Supreme Court.
Steve, any glimmers of hope at all?
I think Heather made a really interesting point. One of the things we have to recognize is over the course of our history, except maybe for 20 years, the court has been an extremely conservative institution. I mean, think about Dred Scott, think about Plessy v. Ferguson, think about, not only on the Supreme Court, but lower courts that made it impossible for working people to organize. And may, again, since Trader Joe's is now about to bring a lawsuit against the NLRB. I think the most immediate problem we may face is Trump's refusal to accept defeat. I mean, that's what we're looking at.
So that was cheery.
Well, until they put us all in camps, I'm still hopeful.
I think you should Heather has a very good take in her book about, which is a more inspiring view based on
It's absolutely true.
Serious history. And so I would pay attention to that.
I agree.
And not pay so much attention to me, because I'm older anyway.
Until 2024.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you all. This was a total pleasure.
Thank you all.